we left off on the Children's Corner, and eventually the show went to network. Can you tell me about that?
Well, it seems that a producer from NBC came to see Ben Spock, who was doing a program on WQED called Parents and Dr. Spock. And while she was waiting for that program to come on, she was sitting in the lobby and watching the set, and all of a sudden the Children's Corner came on. And she looked at it and she said, I think that's something that NBC might be interested in. Her name was Doris Ann, and she was head of religious programming for NBC. And so she presented it to the network, and they asked if we would come and replace Paul Winchell and Jerry Mahoney for the 4 weeks that they would be on vacation that summer. And so Josie and I flew to New York and had meetings with all of these people, and the only suggestion that they made was that we have larger puppets. Our puppets were quite small. And so we said, well, we don't know how to do that. And they said, we'll have them made for you. And so they had a puppet maker talk with us, and that's when these larger puppets were made, and they were made for NBC's Saturday morning program. All up for sure. And so we went over and did those 4 programs, and the response was so great that when Winchell and Mahoney came back to do their regular program, they said, well, we'd like you to do one too. Now, we did, I don't know how many weeks we did that. Long time, year or so. We would do the Children's Corner all week long, and then on Friday we would fly to New York, have a production meeting, do this program Saturday morning, fly back and do that. In other words, we did 6 programs a week.
Oh, that must have been grueling.
5 of them were an hour each, and the 6th one was a half hour.
How did you pick the theme of the network program?
Well, we just talked.
So
you know, the way it was before. I mean, it was just amazing that you could go on the air and have such an easy dialogue. And on that program, I definitely was never seen. It was Josie and the Puppets. But Frances Horwich was head of children's programming then at NBC, and she had a program called Ding Dong School. And I remember her saying, you know, the days of children's programming here are limited, so don't be surprised if somebody says, we don't want you anymore. Well, we were called a couple weeks later to the office of one of the vice presidents, and I remember this so clearly because I thought it was so bizarre. He said, you all have done very well with the Children's Corner on Saturday morning. I must say, though, that my child is so invested in that program, I figure that it can't be for the masses. And so that was his way of saying, you finish out this contract and not come back. But you know, one thing led to another, and it all worked out the way it was supposed to.
Now, you talked about back at QED, Dr. Spock had a show. Did you deal with him at all?
Did I what?
Deal with him in any way or talk with him about child theories and things like that?
Well, this program of his was his talking with parents for a half an hour each week. And that was an excellent program. Dr. Spock was the medical director of the place where I did my practical work, the Arsenal Family and Children's Center. Margaret McFarland was the administrative director, and Ben Spock was the medical director. This was before he went to Cleveland. Also, one of the people who came to consult with all of us at the Arsenal was Eric Erickson. And so we just had the best of everything here for the study of normal child development. I was, you know, I was just at the right place at the very right time, and every year that went on, I knew that the decision to leave New York and to come to Pittsburgh and launch into this place that nobody had ever heard of was absolutely the correct one for me. It gave me a chance to use all the talents that I had ever been given. You know, I loved children, I loved drama, I loved music, I loved whimsy, I loved puppetry. I mean, all of those. And when I talked with Margaret, and Margaret McFarland then became our chief psychological consultant, and I worked with her every week, at least 3 times a month, on scripts and lyrics and everything that I produced. And she would just tell me stories about children, and that's how she taught us. But what was I going to say about Margaret? At any rate, we developed all of these programs, and I wish I could rewind that tape for just about a minute and try to find my train of thought. Well, I'm glad you all had a good lunch. I had a little bit of a rest. It's hard to talk about yourself. I mean, I'd much rather talk about you all.
Well, we really appreciate that you're doing this. How long did the show last, the Children's Corner?
Children's Corner was on for about 8 years.
Okay. And why did it go off the air in Pittsburgh?
Well, when I went to Canada and Josie had so many commercial commitments, when I came back, the people wanted us to make an expanded version of the Canadian Mr. Rogers, and that's when Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood began. And there were times that Josie came as a guest, but it wasn't like the old days at all, because Josie went then to South Carolina to do a program on her own called Wheeee, W-H-E-E-E-E. And you'll probably talk with her. But she linked up with Rick Seeback there, who I think did the puppet work for her in South Carolina. And he now produces some of the most wonderfully whimsical programs here at WQED that are beginning to go over the network. The latest one was about amusement parks all over the country. And the one before that was the hot dog show. And Rick has this great facility, this wonderful ability to talk with people, real people, out in the field, you know, and they'll tell him these fabulous stories about the kind of hot dog that they like the best, or what amusement parks, and they have, somehow people trust him so much that they give him their memories. But Josie's worked with a lot of different people. In fact, she worked with Johnny Costa, who was our musical director, and he played a part, he did the music for her. This was down at KDKA. But he also played the part of Indian Mary. And he dressed up as a Native American and smoked a cigar, never said a word on the program. But he got to be very popular. Well, now Johnny is a whole program in himself, you know. He's one of the great jazz musicians of the world. And for him to loan us his talent all those years, we had a wonderful relationship. I really respected him.
Well, before we go on to Mr. Rogers, one last question about the Children's Corner.
Uh-huh.
What is your favorite memory of the show, of a particular scene or something that you did that you're very proud of on that show?
No, it's so hard to think of isolated moments. I think of one day when Josie came from KDKA, and she was really upset. I don't know what had happened. You know, things can happen in commercial television that maybe they don't happen so much in public broadcasting. At any rate, she came in. Ernie Coombs had started the program, and she came in and she just said to Daniel, "I am so upset." And Daniel just said, "Well, you just tell me about it," you know, and she just bared her soul to him. And this was so real. I mean, I don't think, I wonder if she even knew that we were on the air and the camera was on. She probably did, but she trusted Daniel's ears so, and she trusted her audience so, that she could be her whole self. And again, you know, I suppose I've said it too many times, but this is such a personal medium that's what matters. Television has the chance of building a real community out of an entire country. It has a wonderful opportunity of doing that. We see that in times of crisis. It can really bring people together. And now there are many common memories. That's one of the things, one of the dividends about being on so long is that children who grew up with the neighborhood can be having children and also grandchildren, and it's like an old book. It's like an old classic book, and you get if your parents read a certain book to you that their parents read to them, and they had that warm feeling about being read to, they pass that on to their children. There isn't anything like that as far as comfortable roots are concerned. It's fun to be part of that kind of tradition. I never in a million years would have expected that I'd be sitting here talking with you about this after, well, 1951 there at NBC. In 2001, it'll be 50 years as part of this industry.
Do you think that, you know, like the advent of cable has diluted that, so there'll be less commonality?
I don't know. All I hope for is that people will stick with a program that's really good, that it'll be supported over a long period of time, so those traditions can last. I mean, I would love to be able to offer, let me put it a different way. The boys and Joanne and I used to watch the Waltons every week that it was on. I think it would be wonderful if our kids then show it to their children, because they would have the feeling that we had. Maybe they wouldn't want to, but at least be available.
Okay, while you were on the Children's Corner, you also were going to school.
Yeah, went over to the seminary on my lunch hour. Finally, I thought, well, I was accepted when I was in college. Why not at least try some courses? So I went over to Western Theological Seminary before it merged with Pitt Xenia to become Pittsburgh Seminary. And the first course that I took was Systematic Theology with Dr. William Orr. And Dr. Orr turned out to be one of the greatest professors I ever had. And that was the beginning of the seminary training, and it took me 8 years, but I finally finished.
Talk a little bit about Dr. Orr. What did he give to you?
He had a deep and abiding faith. And in his later years, when he was in the nursing home, Joanna and I used to visit him every week. And I remember one time coming to him saying, you know, I'd love to know what this means. One little word shall fell him. We had just sung a hymn at church, and we went to visit him this Sunday. And it says, the Prince of Darkness grim, we tremble not for him. For lo, his doom is sure. And then it goes on, and then at the end it says, one little word shall fell him. And I said, Dr. Orr, what is that one little word that would wipe out evil? And he said, Fred, it's forgiveness. The only thing that evil cannot stand is forgiveness. He said, it simply disintegrates in the presence of forgiveness. This was Dr. Orr himself. I mean, talk about absent-minded as far as outside things were concerned. I mean, he'd come into the room. He was a smoker, and he would flick his ash in the wastebasket, and one time it caught fire, and he was lecturing, and he just took his foot and put the fire out. He didn't skip one syllable. He just kept on talking. Fabulous, fabulous man. Oh, I mean, in life to have teachers that I have had. I mean, you're blessed to have one teacher like I've had. I've had many. I mean, Dr. Orr and Margaret McFarland and Eric Erickson and Ben Spock and the people in television that I've known. I mean, Beth is a wonderful teacher herself, Beth Sullivan, who is the creator of Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman, and many other things. And all of these people, you know, you get to be friends with these people. And the best things in life are the things that you can't buy and can't even plan for.
Did you, what did you study? Was it child? Were you working with children at that point?
Not yet. It was after I graduated with it was called a Bachelor of Divinity. No, I'm sorry, Master of Divinity, MDiv it's called. Then I went on to take the master's course in counseling. And the man who was in charge of that said, I want you all in the class to work with one person for the whole semester, at least once a week. And so and of course this would be somebody who would sign up to talk with you and this was a pastoral counseling course. So I went up to the professor and I said, would it be all right if I worked with a child instead of an adult? And he said, certainly, so long as you have your supervision with Dr. Margaret McFarland. And that's how I was introduced to Margaret. And so she helped me to understand how you have play interviews with children, and the toys that you set forth, and then the interpretation of the play. And that's when we'd use so many puppets and all of the other things. But that's when I had my practicum work at the same time as I was doing that program at the seminary. I was doing the master's program in child development at the University of Pittsburgh. And so Margaret was my professor for both.
When were you ordained?
Ordained
Mhm.
in '62.
Did you have
Yeah.
a mission?
I was ordained by the Pittsburgh Presbytery to work with families through the mass media. It's the only ordination I know of that kind.
Was that of your choosing? Did you devise, that?
Well, I think that the brethren were very wise, because the program was already established, and they knew that this was a decent pulpit. They knew that I wasn't overtly religious in what I was doing, but I think they believed that the Holy Spirit was operative in the work, and that's what matters.
And then you went to Canada, right? Is that after you?
Went to Canada. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And we talked a little bit about Fred Rainsbury.
Fred Rainsbury.
Why did you go to Canada in the first place?
When I graduated from the seminary, I was expecting to produce a program for the Presbyterian Church. There had been some conversations about, we really should get into television, and why don't we do a program with Fred? So the day before commencement, I found out that they weren't able to raise the money to do a program for the church. The day after commencement, I had a call from Fred Rainsbury saying, I want to produce a new 15-minute program to go back to back with Bob Hummey's Friendly Giant. And I'd like you to do it. And thinking that I would be doing the puppets and the music, I said, okay. So Joanne and the two boys and I moved to Toronto, rented a house, and that's when I found out that he wanted me to be on the screen. He said, I've seen you talk with kids, Fred, and I want to translate that to television. So we started. But I had known him before because I had written a musical special for him.
And what was that?
It was called A Peaceable Kingdom. And Bruce Attridge was the producer on the CBC. But that was fun. That's sort of a preamble to the little operas that we do on the neighborhood.
Talk about developing your new show. Did it start out as you on camera the whole time, or did you mix it with the puppets? How did you do that?
Yes, we used the same sort of neighborhood of make-believe. And then we had Canadian guests come and talk with the puppets. There wasn't a hostess per se like Josie who would talk to all the puppets. There was a Nurse Miller, Maxine Miller came. Bly, Alan Bly. We called him Captain Bly. He was one of the guests. Both of them were wonderful singers. Alan went on to produce the Smothers Brothers program. So he then became, this was years later, but he then became part of the Hollywood scene. But when he was in Canada, he was an actor. There were a lot of different people, and of course Arnie Coombs was the assistant puppeteer.
Was he the only one that came with you?
Yes.
Toronto?
Mm-hmm. We had a very nice year in Toronto. Joanne and I liked the people a lot, and it was a tough decision. And I had nothing to come back to in broadcasting, but I did have a job to come back to in the church. I I was going to be in charge of the educational program of the United Oakland Ministry. And once I got back, a friend from a department store said, you know, I'd love to do just a few programs at Christmas time. This was Joseph Horn Company. Would you consider just a few programs? I said, oh, I think we can do it. You know, just a few. And so we did that on Channel 4 here. It was the first time that first and last time that I've ever done any commercials. And was it King Friday or somebody that, we must ask Joe Negri because he was musical director out there. And there was something that the king said, yes, it's very, very good. It had something to do with some sweet cookie or something. And he said, very, very good. But that's the only commercial I think that I've ever done.
Why is that?
Oh, I don't, I'm just very grateful that I haven't had to do commercials. I'm so concerned about, particularly about selling things to children. I would never have done it on my own. I mean, I would have said, I'm going home if they said that it had to be Fred who did it. But King Friday set aside his crown that day and did very, very good. No, I disapprove of hosts of children's programming pitching anything because they're to be trusted by the children and they're not to use that trust to be hucksters.
Tell me, how did the name Mr. Rogers begin? As far as that was the name of the show.
That was Fred Rainsbury. I had nothing to do with it. He said, well, call it Mr. Rogers. And he said, and let's make it all one word. And so it started out Misterogers. That was the Canadian name. And when we came back here, and finally PBS said, you know, we've got 5 stations that want children's programs. If you're able to get the rights of your Neighborhood of Make-Believe segments from the Canadian programs, then why don't you make a full half hour and insert that Neighborhood of Make-Believe in it? And so that's what we did with the first 100 programs. We used the Canadian Neighborhood of Make-Believe, and I was on camera for the beginning and the end and had reality. We expanded the reality segments. That's how those first 100 programs for Eastern Educational Network, EEN, that's how it began.
Okay, let's stop there to change the tape.